All right. Hi, my name is Bill Figueroa. I just finished, or I just defended my dissertation in history at University of Pennsylvania. The title, as you can see here, is China and the Iranian Left, Transnational Networks of Social, Cultural, and Ideological Exchange, 1905 to 1979. And what it does is it surveys the history of Sino-Iranian relations from the Iranian Constitutional Revolution in 1905 to the Islamic Revolution of 1979. I argue that traditional ties between modern China were mostly severed by the rise of European global colonial networks, but that the same new networks allowed for new forms of contact and interaction between the two countries. Through newspapers and through telegraph networks, both Iranian and Chinese intellectuals became aware of one another and were inspired by each other's history and modern political movements. It also analyzes the ties between the Iranian communist organizations and the Iranian Communist Party. In the 1950s, there were informal contacts between the Tudeh Party, which is Iran's major communist organization. I hope that anybody watching this probably knows that already, and the Chinese Communist Party. And the idea of China is what actually played the most important role ultimately in the 1960s, as Iranian and Chinese youth began to think of themselves as part of a larger global community of oppressed nations locked in conflict with imperialist powers. Many on the left, especially students studying abroad in Europe or the United States, Iranian students that is, studied Chinese texts and drew on Maoist theories to analyze Iran and to criticize the older generation of the communist Tudeh leadership. China directly participated in and encouraged these developments, first by public support for the Tudeh party, and then later with covert support for an explicitly Maoist splinter group, Sazman Engelabie Hezb Tudeh, the revolutionary organization of the Tudeh party. I mean, the first question that you might want to ask, from a project like this is why take a historical approach? Sino-Iranian relations has been really important lately, but mainly in the context of modern connections. China's strategic location in the Gulf, or Iran's strategic location in the Gulf, and China's interest in access to the world supply of oil, the context of a U.S.-China rivalry. This is really what makes people interested in Sino-Iranian relations today. And the literature, when they talk about this, they basically don't have any kind of historical perspective. It mostly begins in 1971, which is the year that China and Iran established official relations. And they treat Sino-Iranian relations as something that's more or less new. But even if the significance, the strategic significance of these ties is recent, the history of interactions between the two countries is not new at all. So to me, I think it's important to not only be able to understand current ties in the context of what came before them, but also to prevent the application of what I sometimes call bad history
Mm.
to these contemporary issues. So actors on all sides of modern Sino-Iranian or debates about Sino-Iranian studies, they tend to make polemical or alarmist arguments. There was one time I remember it was kind of in vogue to talk about how these connections between Maoism and Islamofascism, this idea that, and you still see it to this day, this idea that like China and Iran are somehow more dangerous of an alliance because they both represent some antithesis of Western democracy, or because there are similarities between Ayatollah Khomeini's approach to politics and Mao Zedong's approach. Or sometimes, in the books that came out in 2009, Edward Berman's China and Iran Parallel History Future Threat question mark. I think that kind of gives you a sense of what sort of approach that this guy is taking. um, this book argues that more or less that China and Iran have a natural animosity towards the West, and that they're sort of fated to work together to oppose Western policy in the Middle East. So, in light of these kinds of arguments that you find in trade presses and in the news media, I think it is really important to have a good and accurate history of Sino-Iranian relations as an antidote to these kind of ahistorical claims. So, in order to do that, I set out to study China and Iran's history of unofficial reactions, because I from the beginning, I was aware of this connection between Chinese Communist Party and Iranian Maoists, and I kind of just worked out from there. I noticed that each period of Sino-Iranian interaction, when I looked at it through the lens of newspapers that were published in both countries, they each had its own sort of flavor that reflected the ideas that were prevalent at the time. Chinese and Iranians were interpreting each other's history through the lens of their own experiences. So from there, I began reading about diplomacy studies and identity formation, which became like the two major methodological and historical debates that inform my study and the approach that I take. Um, so just really quickly, and I don't want to get too bogged down in methodology. I'm a historian after all. I mean, what do we use that for? But with when it comes to diplomacy studies, I started with the observation that identity and international relations are really, intricately and inextricably linked. Modern works of diplomacy studies examine more than just official state-to-state interactions. So, to quote one scholar, diplomatic exchanges are permeated with debates on the nature or fundamental qualities, one might say identities, of nations, governments, non-state actors, or indeed any pertinent actor in the global social arena. And Sino-Iranian studies also tends to be focused on the state-to-state sort of connections. Like I said, they really look at the story of Sino-Iranian relations beginning in 1971. So building on this idea, I conceptualize Sino-Iranian relations as more than just state-to-state interactions, but a combination of official and unofficial connections. This allows me to emphasize the global origins of the Iranian Revolution and the international context that it developed in. The traditional studies of modern Iranian history are mostly focused on domestic factors, but more recently, there's been a lot more transnational approaches like this. Um, and it also allows us to examine how different groups of Iranians and Chinese intellectuals thought about one another, and by extension, about themselves, both through official and unofficial moments of interaction. And that's kind of the other major methodological approach that I take, is this question of identity and the other. The idea of looking at how identities are constructed through reference to some kind of foreign other is not a new idea, right? It's a really old idea. And this is found in both Chinese studies and Iranian studies. Um, a lot has been written about how both official and personal identities about this and ideas about the self are often intertwined with ideas about the other, and how studying how a society represents outsiders can reveal a lot about what they think about themselves. But this other is typically a Western other in the context of Asia. Asian elites are usually depicted as being primarily or even exclusively inspired by European and American ideas in the 19th and 20th century. Very few studies have looked at inter-Asian connections, studies societies that have looked east rather than looking west. And in doing so, they have created, perhaps unintentionally, the impression that modern Iranian or Chinese history was made entirely as a reflection or inspired by the West. Hamid Debashi argues against this in his recent book, Persophilia, which sort of flips the formula on its head and studies European fascinations with Persia rather than Persian fascinations with Europe. My goal is not so much to flip it on its head, but to kind of sidestep the formula by looking at connections across Asia.
Mhm.
um, One of the biggest and most important insights and contributions to my work was the work of Mishra Pankaj in Ruins of Empire. He demonstrates that Asia in this period was interconnected, and he really pushes back against this kind of Eurocentric reading of Iranian and Chinese history, and allows me to do so as well. He shows that Asian intellectuals were inspired by their neighbors and by one another as much as they were by the West. For example, like the Iranian constitution is a lot more like the Turkish constitution than any European constitution, and the Chinese constitution is more like the Japanese constitution, which makes sense, right? These are their neighbors. That's what you'd expect. It's not to downplay the influence of Western society, but to suggest that figures like Nasir al-Din Shah or Reza Khan or Sun Yat-sen or Liang Qichao were I'm trying to suggest that they were more than just a product of a collision between the East and the West, to quote one newspaper from the 1870s talking about Nasir al-Din Shah in China. Rather, I would argued that they are part of a deeper and a more complex process of exchange and comparison and identity construction that included Asian references as much as, if not sometimes more than, Western ones.
Mm-hmm.
So as far as sources go, just very quickly, I rely on Chinese periodicals like Shenbao, Guangming Zhibao, Renmin Zhibao, as well as English language Chinese press, the North China Herald, China Weekly. The English language press is basically newspapers that were aimed at expatriates and diplomats living in China, but they also circulated amongst Chinese elites. So they had some influence on, those who could speak European languages. I look at Iranian travelogues and periodicals, including one from an Iranian ambassador to China in 1949, Mehdi Faroukh. This one's really interesting and hasn't been analyzed by scholars yet, so I'm very excited to bring that out. I also look at published interviews with 4 Iranian student dissidents who traveled to China for military and ideological training in the 1960s. These were conducted by Hamid Shokat, who is a scholar of the Iranian left and a former student activist himself. And I also use a little bit of US Foreign Archives documents in relation to the 60s and 70s as well. So the results of my work, I'll kind of take you through chapter by chapter. There's only 4 chapters, so it won't take too long. Chapter 1, I examine the reconstruction of Sino-Iranian relations in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And what I uncover is that by the early 1900s, the traditional ties and diplomatic connections between China and Iran had, for the most part, lapsed. In this chapter, I explore technological innovations from trains to steamships to telegraphs and development of newspaper technology that contributed to both the discontinuity and later the reconstitution of Sino-Iranian relations in the 20th century. Chinese interest in the Iranian Revolution is placed in the context of a global pan-Asian anti-colonial movement. Chinese elites' ideas about China were expressed in a new discourse of Sino-Iranian solidarity, one in which an imagined global community of Asian constitutional states was challenging the global system dominated by European colonialism. Chinese and British elites debated these issues in the pages of Shanghai newspapers, and the information networks slowly fell under Chinese control over time. Chinese elites would buy these newspapers from the British, and as they did so, expressions of support for Iranian constitutional revolution increased substantially. What I also found was that Iran was less interested in China than China was interested in Iran at this period, and it's largely a question of timing. The Chinese Revolution happened. The Iranian constitutional revolution happened before the constitutional revolution happened in China, so it was kind of an inspiring moment in the lead up to it. Whereas the Chinese constitutional revolution happened in 1911, when the Iranian constitutional revolution was not only already underway, but already under siege and was going through a lot of difficulties. So it just doesn't seem to have inspired, in the opposite direction as much. But I was able to establish that Iranian elites were aware of events in China, and they were able to read about them in newspapers like Habl al-Matin, which was published in Calcutta. And I'm looking forward to being able to explore more of these constitutional newspapers going forward. I expect I will find more things about the Chinese Revolution that I haven't been able to find so far. And I have some here. So, on the left here, this picture is from one of those newspapers. These English language Chinese press, they often would compare China and Iran in sort of unfavorable ways. They'd say, "Oh my goodness, look at how badly constitutionalism is going in Persia. How could you expect it to go well here in China? What a silly
Oh,
thing to think."
wow.
Yeah. But even in the Chinese press, when it was controlled by the British, Chinese interest in Persia goes back very far. So this is the earliest article I could find in the modern era. There's anecdotes from the Persian Shah's tour of England, talking about Nasir al-Din's famous
Yeah.
trip to Europe in 1873, and the full story. Basically talks about the Shah is talking about how expensive horses are, in because he goes to like a racetrack and he's talking about how expensive the horses are, and he's like, why would I ever buy a horse when that expensive? I could buy 10 trucks for the price of that. And it's
Priorities.
so I don't actually know. I think that might actually be a translation from an article in the British press, because this newspaper was affiliated with Britain at the time.
Mhm.
But as time moves forward, you stop seeing positive discussions about the Iranian Shah, the Persian Shah, and you start to see articles that say things like, oh, the Persian Shah, committed autocratic acts and attempted to rescind the Persian parliament, or these sorts of things. And they cover all of the events of the Iranian Revolution very closely. Um, in chapter 2, I explored developments between what I call semi-official relations between Iran and the Republic of China, 1920 to 1941. These relations I call semi-official because they consisted mostly of like ad hoc diplomatic representation, consulates instead of ambassadors and things like of that nature. And they were ultimately replaced by official relations with the People's Republic of China in 1971. For those who are not entirely familiar, what I'm talking about here is in after the constitutional revolution in China, the country was represented by the nationalists, ultimately by Chiang Kai-shek. Once the Chinese Civil War, came to a conclusion in 1949, the communists took over the country, and the nationalists fled to Taiwan. That's where they remain to this day. And Iran maintained its relations with nationalist China, not communist China, until 1971. So the main contribution of this chapter is to sketch out a narrative of those relations between nationalist China and Iran, which up until now has been basically absent in the literature, and attempt to give some explanation as to the reason China and Iran pursued diplomacy with one another in this era. I demonstrate that Iranian and Chinese merchant interests in Shanghai, actually, especially tea and silk traders, played a larger role than previously thought in driving the establishment of the Sino-Iranian Friendship Treaty of 1920, which is the first official contact between the two countries in the modern era. And ultimately the creation of an Iranian consulate in Shanghai in 1936. Sino-Iranian semi-official relations emerged in the context of both competition and cooperation at the League of Nations, especially around the issues of the international opium trade. China wanted to stop it. Iran wanted to not stop selling opium to China. As Sino-Iranian relations remained largely confined to these expressions of mutual admiration and low-level diplomatic ties, this chapter also works to recover the ways in which Chinese and Iranian people represented relations with one another and how those representations reflected their views about themselves. So, for example, positive portrayals of Reza Shah as a populist modernizer in the Chinese press reflected the ideological and political affinities between Chiang Kai-shek's China and Pahlavi Iran. Which also contributed to this resumption of relations. And so here I have, on the left-hand side, this is one of those letters from Persian and Chinese tea merchants to the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce. And according to these letters, they have been, repeatedly asking for better relations between China and Iran, mostly because they want to be able to ship products directly between the two countries. As I mentioned in the previous section, commercial ties between the two had largely been circumvented by railroad networks that brought these products through Russia or through India, which is part of the British Empire. So they pitched this as a kind of nationalist, we need to reclaim the tea and the silk trade, as part of our empire, or as part of our nationalist, our project. And these are here just pictures of the first consul, the first diplomat to represent Iran. His name was, at least in the English language press, was represented as K. Ostavan. I'm not sure exactly what that corresponds to. Something I'm working on to see if I can track him elsewhere. But he's also, as you can see, he's mentioned both in the English language and the Chinese press here. So they're following these issues very closely. In chapter 3, I survey the impact of the Chinese Communist Revolution of 1949 on official and unofficial Sino-Iranian relations. So from 49 to 59, the success of the CCP, that's the Chinese Communist Party, influenced both the state and the opposition groups, and created two competing narratives of Chinese history in the Iranian public sphere. In one, China served as a warning to Iran as what could happen if the Iranian left had its way, and was associated largely with the dangers of communism. In the other, China was portrayed as like a revolutionary model to be emulated, an inspiring city on a hill, an example of what could be achieved if Iranian communists followed their example. This first attitude was embraced by the Iranian state and its elite supporters, and appeared in the pages of cultural magazines like Etela'at Mahane, and in the memoirs of diplomats who visited the country like Mehdi Farouk. He actually describes witnessing the communist takeover of Nan. All right, sorry, we're back. Some technical difficulties. So as I was saying, Mehdi Farouk wrote an account of his experiences. That was the first publication that introduced modern Chinese history to an Iranian audience, and it was unapologetically anti-communist. In one, he actually includes some letters he wrote to friends of his, other diplomats, who asked him what's so important about China that we have to care about it here in Iran. And he says, basically like we have, what happened in China could so easily happen in Iran, and we have the same, third column in our country. And now that I've told you about everything that's happened, you must understand why it's important. So he really puts it in direct and service of this, pro monarchist, state narrative, anti-communist sort of approach. In the second half of the chapter, I explore the pro-communist counter-narrative through a survey of Chinese newspapers that document Iranian students and political activists who traveled to China for solidarity conferences and various sorts of international student movement type of activities in the 1950s. Through these and other expressions of solidarity at home and abroad, a robust network of ideological and social exchange existed in the 1950s between Communist China and the Iranian communist organizations like the Tudeh Party. So here on the left, this is just an example of like the types of cultural articles they would have at the time. This is about actually, it's about a European opera that's related to China, something like called
It's
Puccini or
Turandot,
something.
isn't that Turandot?
Yeah, Toronto. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
But
Turandot.
I find it's really interesting because it has this sort of um,
Japanese style.
yeah, Chinese style, a quote unquote Asian style font. So you can, and this is popular in the West at the time as well. And part of the reason for that is that their source of information, the Iranian state, is Western news articles. So they're reading the same sort of arguments about the loss of China. It's the faults of the Americans for not supporting Chiang Kai-shek enough. They're making all of these sort of arguments in the Iranian newspapers. And then here on the right is so like I said, the magazine, the Mehdi Farouk's travelogue, it partially tries to introduce Chinese history and Chinese culture to an Iranian audience. So what you see here is one section on Chinese characters where he attempts to reproduce, possibly from memory based on how interesting his rendering of some of these characters are, what the characters, and you see underneath he's written the meaning. The meaning he's largely gotten correct. So, and there's a lot of great images like this that I have in my
That's
dissertation.
fascinating.
Um, for one of my favorite little like just small aside, he says that what he kind of is reading Chinese society through his own experiences, but also his own prejudices and ideas of and whatnot. So one of the things that he says that I got a big kick out of was he says there are no Jews in China because the Chinese are so good at money they don't need them, basically. And I mean, so obviously is he's not only expressing some stereotypes about both Chinese and Iranian people, or Chinese people and Jews, I mean, but also he's totally wrong. There are Jews in China, or at
Yeah,
least there were at some point.
that's
Um,
that's what
so I always thought that was kind of funny. So yeah,
that's
he's
kind of
some
hilarious.
really interesting
Very.
segments there. So here's just a little bit more from that era. On the left, this is Chiang Kai-shek in the pages of Etela'at Mahane. So they had a big spread of him, obviously, in the middle of an article about the situation in China. On the right is a political cartoon by a Chinese cartoonist named Fang Cheng. Um, in this cartoon, as you can see, I'll just briefly go through it. Uncle Sam is replacing a poster. On the poster, it says American Monopoly over another poster that says British Monopoly. He's
Wow.
dipping a brush that says mediate the British-Iranian dispute, and the paste bucket is labeled American loans to Iran. So, like these loans are being used to, and under the guise of mediating the dispute, they're
Mm.
kind of just replacing the British with them. And as you can see in the back, a very grumpy tweed jacketed British man that I like to call Mr. Britain,
Mr. Britain.
and because his hat just says Britain in Chinese.
Wow. A very astute comic, though.
Right, yeah, very
Very
interesting
astute.
comics. So there are a lot of other comics like this. I think in the first, yeah, this is another one here.
Oh, yeah.
Both of these are just labeled the, what is it, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company and whatever its American equivalent was. The name is escaping me right now.
That's just
Um,
conglomerate, I suppose, of different companies like ExxonMobil, I think, those kind of.
right, exactly, yeah, it's whatever the Chinese name for that consortium is. Um,
Right,
and so, like I said, it's escape. But that is actually, it was like a Hungarian, like they were republished Soviet comics with like Chinese,
right.
character, translation. But this one was actually drawn by a famous Chinese political cartoonist. So there was also commentary from this angle as well. I'm hoping to find more examples of things like this.
Mm,
Here is Mehdi Farouk meeting Chiang Kai-shek in 1949.
mm.
Um, I just think it's a really cool picture.
That's really
Like
beautiful.
I said, this is right before the communists took over Nanjing,
I love this.
and they actually allowed the Iranians embassy to peacefully go home.
Excellent.
So that's one positive.
It's epic.
Here on the left, you see a picture of Reza Radmanesh, the head leader of the CCP or of the Tudeh Party in 1958 at the Eighth Chinese Communist Party Congress.
Mm,
And I don't have it translated here, but he says a
mm,
lot. It's a lot of standard, you know, um,
mm,
we support each other in the fraternal communist parties, what have you. But one thing he says is that our Iranian movement can learn a lot from studying the Chinese Communist Revolution,
mm,
and that is a big part of what I talk about in chapter 4,
mm,
because chapter 4 considers the background, the history, and the impact of the Iranian Maoist movement and the Sino-Iranian or Sino-Soviet split
mm,
on Iranian leftist politics. So these unofficial connections in the 50s between China and the Tudeh Party, they don't play a huge role, but they set the stage for this really important set of interactions and development of Iranian Maoism in the 60s, which does, in my opinion, play a significant role.
mhm,
Um, so my aim for this chapter is basically to construct a sort of a general narrative of the Iranian Maoist movement, that uh, attests to its significance in the uh, Islamic Revolution, and I do that through interviews with members of Sosmone Ingalabi, of the revolutionary organization of the Tudeh Party.
mm,
From their base in Britain and then later in Germany, Iranian students used Maoism as a means to overshadow the traditional leadership of the Iranian left and chart a new revolutionary path forward that embraced armed struggle and the Chinese position in the Sino-Soviet split. Furthermore, I look at the impact of this movement and why China was ultimately willing to sponsor it and allow so many of these students to come to China and to teach them about ideological and military guerrilla training and things like and what have you. Uh, my what I basically come up with is that China was able to gain a valuable source of information about Iran and a useful propaganda tool because it frequently talked about the Iranian, he called them Iranian revolutionaries in the Chinese newspapers, but it was still able to pursue good relations with the Iranian government. Despite the protests of the Sosmane Ingalabi, China never gave real support to either the Kurdish revolt when it was happening in Iran,
mm,
or directly supported any of their attempts to return to Iran and start an actual armed struggle within the country. This is because China was continued to secretly, or at least quietly, send feelers to the Iranian government basically throughout the entire period.
mm,
From the 1950s to the 1960s, on multiple occasions, whether at the Bandung conference or just by sending occasional friendly greetings as they flew over the country. The Chinese government sent signals to the Shah that they would be willing to engage with him if he ever were so inclined.
mm,
Um, Ultimately, the final section of my paper argues that this is actually a factor in why the Shah ultimately decided to pursue closer relations with China in 1966. This comes shortly after an attempt on the Shah's life, popularly known as the Marble Palace Plot in 1965, which was carried out by not quite a Maoist, but a student radical who was affiliated in many ways with these Maoist circles. And in the newspapers, in Le Monde, and also in private conversations with U.S. officials, the Shah started to specifically talk about the threat of Chinese Maoism, of Chinese propaganda, and his concern seemed to be that while he had destroyed to a large amount the actual communist movement in the country, they could do very little to prevent, a student who had been stirred up by crazy, radical communist propaganda, Chinese propaganda, and wanted to try to assassinate him. So I firmly believe that there's evidence, that they're it's not like I didn't find any direct reference to this, but just if you look at the timing, it does seem that one of the reasons, in addition to wanting to pursue a more what's the word I'm looking for, uh, a new approach to foreign policy and kind of broaden his approach. He also wanted to kind of take the wind out of the sails of his Maoist detractors. And in fact, that's exactly what happened. And the positive relations between the Shah and China were an important factor in the decline of the appeal of Maoist politics in the early 1970s. Ultimately, Maoism echoed throughout the tactics of the Marxist and Muslim opposition, and many of them, in fact, cynically or genuinely borrowed the rhetoric of the revolution, both the Iranian state and by more conservative elements of the Islamic opposition. um, so just to kind of conclude here, what sort of big picture accomplishments that my dissertation achieves. I try to shift the focus of Sino-Iranian studies to social history. I try to fill this gap in the literature by providing a much needed narrative and analysis of historical development of modern ties between China and Iran. And I try to bring to light the significance of this set of relations that until now was largely considered a background to the larger drama of Sino-Iranian state-to-state interactions. Ultimately, I reassess the history of Iranian Maoism and try to write a narrative of the 1960s and the Islamic Revolution in which these people and this history play an important role. And that's about it. Feel free to
Great.
ask me any questions.
Yes.
Sorry, I know I
No,
went
no,
on a
no,
little bit there, but
no, no, that's great stuff. No, that's great stuff, Bill. Thank you so much for
yeah,
sharing.
yeah,
And I
no
think it's
problem.
actually a very, very important, it's a very important topic. And I think you've covered everything, and I look forward to reading it and seeing it in a book. But do you think your work has an impact on how we can view China and Iranian relations today? I mean, I know you talked about briefly about how China and Iran sort of together presented this double threat. It was like the double Cold War almost. And do you think that that kind of rhetoric is something that you see now? This idea that China and Iran um, could band together and
Yes.
this horrible threat to Western democracy. And how do you think your work can sort of balance that out, as it were?
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that that's, you put it exactly right. I mean, you do see this to this the very day. There's, a lot of people been following this Iran-China deal that people have been talking
Yeah.
about on social media. It's allegedly going to be this like $400 billion deal between the Iranian and the Chinese government.
Mm,
I actually have an article coming out in Jadaliyya today that shows that not based on my research, but on the research of a lot of other great scholars who are um, doing more quantitative work and more careful analysis that shows that this has been very much exaggerated. This deal's not happening to that level,
mm,
and I do think that my work does have some relevance to that. Rather than depicting China and Iran as as one article put it, totalitarian twins that are trying to spread these anti-democratic values around the world. I show that China and Iran have had a long term but limited relationship throughout all of their history. If you look at the history I've just described, it's very much like ups and downs, fits and starts, beginnings and endings. They
Mm,
have relations with the nationalists. Well, that doesn't really go well, with the current Chinese state. I mean, the current the CCP, was supportive of the Shah up until the revolution, and then immediately afterwards switched support to the Islamic Republic. These
mm,
sorts of, and ultimately, I mean, I think the most important thing from my research particularly is that even during the Maoist era, the height of this kind of ideological fervor, when given the choice between good relations with the Iranian state, which they deemed in their greater strategic interest, or supporting an ideologically driven revolution, they chose stability. And I think that that's still true to this day. China will do what's best for China. China is
mm,
it's a state like any other, and that doesn't just mean that we shouldn't be afraid of Sino-Iranian partnerships, but
mm,
also that we shouldn't be so willing and quick to trumpet them. You see often this idea that China is going to come in and be this like totally different partner, and it's not self-interested, and it's going to have no strings attached. And well, I mean, it's just not true. I mean, there's a lot of examples of the opposite, and also the impact of the sort of this flood of cheap goods, cheap Chinese goods into the Iranian market has caused a lot of economic disruption in Tehran and a lot of other cities, over the last decade. So there's a lot of like I said, these kind of ups and downs,
yeah.
competition and cooperation. But ultimately, I would say that I do want to balance out away from this kind of alarmist, China and Iran are going to ally and take over the world or destroy U.S. policy. I mean, to me, it's very clear the only reason that people, are so afraid is or not afraid, but I guess are freaking out so much, is that it runs counter to U.S. policy towards Iran, and specifically the imposition of sanctions, and trying to create regime change in the
Mm,
country. Um, the China-Iran deal is an economic lifeline, at least to the Iranian government,
mm,
and even that small attempt to to break out of diplomatic isolation, and is met with these sort of apocalyptic predictions of, oh my God, it's an alliance, and they're
yeah.
gonna I mean,
Go over
America has
everything, yeah.
dozens of bases throughout the region. There's very little active threat to the sorts of moves that we're seeing right now.
No,
That's what I would say.
no, I think that's a very balanced and a very fair point. I mean, in a way, it reminds me of, sorry, Iran and Russia. This,
Right.
back in the, in the height of the Cold War, Russia being too close to Iran, and Russia's support of the Tudeh party was seen as, okay, this will lead to a communist state being
Hmm.
elected into, back then, this is the 1940s. They thought that the Tudeh would be elected into power, and that the Soviet Union would have a foothold in Iran. So
Right.
a lot of parallels between what you talk and what you talk about and what you study, and Russian Iranian relations, because even though Moscow was
Absolutely.
very interested in the Tudeh and wanted to prop it up, they very clearly said that they would, and they did, remove support in order to pursue relations with the Shah. And
Right.
when the Shah left, that same support just got shifted to the Islamic Republic.
Hmm.
So in a way, Russia and China kind of act very similarly,
Yes.
and I find that very fascinating. So you need to learn Russian now, Bill.
I made a joke about that once, and the person I made it to just looked at me and was like, "You don't just pick up Russian. Like, it's not one of those."
Not one of those. Yeah. But thank you so much, Bill, for your time and for taking us through an amazing piece of research. And I
Thank
look
you.
forward to seeing where you go next with this. So I really appreciate your time and sharing all of this amazing information with us.
Great. Thank you
Thank you
so
so
much. I really appreciate it. And, thanks for the opportunity. I really love, working with the Iranian Studies Collective.
No,
And,
thank you.
and we, I've got my headset on so we can start our Dota match after this, right?
Absolutely. Yes. Keep going. Thank
All
you.
right. Great. Thanks a lot.